capacity crowd, as far as anybody at home knows. I'm Jonathan Haupt. I'm the executive director here at our nonprofit Pat Conroy Literary Center. And this evening we get to welcome Susan Beckham Zurenda, who's here in town in support of her debut novel, Bells for Eli. Susan's a veteran of the classroom, having taught English for 33 years. More recently, she's become a great treasure to all of us who've gotten to know her through her work with Magic Time Literary Publicity. Susan's fiction writing has received several regional awards, including from the South Carolina Fiction Project, the Porter Fleming Literary Competition, and the Southern Writers Symposium, and her stories and nonfiction pieces have appeared in a number of journals. Susan lives and writes in Spartanburg, but she's here with us tonight in Beaufort because she's also in town to participate in season 3 of the South Carolina educational TV show By the River, which is supported in part by Pat Conroy Literary Center. Our center's queen mother, Cassandra King, who could not be with us in person this evening, praised Susan's novel, saying, quote, "It is a stunning debut. Bells for Eli establishes Susan Zurenda as one of the most exciting new voices in Southern fiction. In this tender, beautifully rendered novel, powerful connection between cousins Delia and Eli takes them on a journey fraught with longing, desire, and heartbreak. Through loss, Delia comes to understand that the bonds of love can never truly be broken." So let's welcome Susan Zurenda.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all for coming out during these strange times in which we are living. I'm going to talk a little bit this evening about the 1960s in the small town South that I knew, and which is the setting of Bells for Eli. So I'll ask you all, how many of you remember eating moon pies?
I do.
In the sun with chocolate dripping down your fingers, right? At the swimming pool. That's when I ate moon pies while the eagle landed or touched down on the moon's tranquility base. Or junior high school parties where black lights made your teeth glow green while Agent Orange laid waste to the jungles of Vietnam. Or making out at drive-in movies in high school while hippies gathered for love-ins at Golden Gate Park. Well, this was my era, and I think it might have been you all's era as well. It was a contradictory time, teetering between devotion to conventional values from the 50s and the desire to do what you feel in the 60s and the 70s. And in Bells for Eli, where my main characters live and other settings are largely imagined, but they are based on the realities of the time and the locale of my own youth. My main characters, Adeline, she's called Delia Green, and Ellison, who's known as Eli Winfield, they live in the fictitious small town of Green Branch, South Carolina during this momentous period, and they are deeply affected by their time and their place. Against this background, my story is inspired by a tragic incident that actually happened to a first cousin of mine when he was a toddler in the late 1950s. As is the case with my character Eli, my cousin Danny saw a Coca-Cola bottle sitting on the back steps at his home in Plainfield, New Jersey, and he drank from it, and that Coca-Cola bottle had Red Devil Lye in it. And my uncle, as I understand it, I was in South Carolina, and Danny and I were about the same age, so this is all secondhand knowledge, but he was using that chemical. It has properties like helium, so he was using it to blow up balloons for Danny's birthday party. Well, my cousin, of course, was deeply damaged by that accident. He lived, but his life was forever compromised. And so Eli suffers a similar kind of accident, and that is what propels the plot of my novel. So in my novel, these two first cousins grow up across the street from each other. I didn't grow up with my real cousin. He lived in a different state. But they grow into an unusually close relationship during their childhood and adolescence, partly because they live across the street, but more because it's the consequences of Eli's accident. And as he encounters bullying from his schoolmates who don't understand and who mock his disfigurement, Delia becomes his best friend and his defender. And then later, in adolescence, when his tubes from his throat and his stomach are gone, he appears normal on the outside. He bolts into adolescence, a heartbreaker, with a double standard, guarding Delia's vulnerability when she ventures into a destructive romantic relationship, and is determined, as Delia is, to rescue her beloved cousin from his demons. He is equally determined to protect her, especially when she becomes involved in a destructive romantic relationship. So this cousin's relationship grows into really an incomparable love, blossoming into an intimacy that cannot be, for they know that to love one's cousin is taboo. And the novel will conclude, or does conclude, with Delia's shocking discovery about secrets about Eli and truths that she has never known. So the times and the culture in which these cousins live, as I mentioned, tremendously affects them, their joys, their sorrows, their conflicts, their decisions. And if you are, and I think this audience is, a baby boomer like me, or even those who are not, you likely think of the 60s as a generation of rebellion and social change. And rather than, the 60s per se, I think of, and I'm not the only one that does, but the 60s really sort of loosely begin with the assassination of John F. Kennedy and end with the Watergate scandal in 1974. It was an era defined by the counterculture of the hippies and the revolution in social norms surrounding music, drugs, dress, sexuality, formality, as well as the relaxation of social taboos in terms of race and gender. It was a decade of tremendous volatility and upheaval, when African Americans used sit-ins, freedom rides, and protest marches to fight segregation, poverty, and unemployment, when women began demanding equal job opportunities and an end to sexual discrimination, when Mexican Americans protested discrimination in voting, education, and employment, and when Native Americans demanded that the government recognize their land claims and the rights of tribes to govern themselves. But this view is not the whole picture of the 60s. Amid this time of extreme social flux, the small town South, at least the small town South that I knew of the 1960s and 70s, was still a very insular time and place where fathers went to work each morning to provide for the family. Mothers pretty much took care of the children. It was a time that focused on middle-class Americans who could give their children more advantages than they had more disposable income, and this generation of parents enjoyed greater material comfort than their forebears had, and they had more time and more money for leisure activities, and therefore more time for the consumption of popular culture. With the United States being the world's leading industrial power in the aftermath of World War II, and government support for education, home loans, and a booming economy emerging, the parents of this generation who had grown up as children of the Depression wanted their children to have more. So achieving that sort of proverbial understanding of the American dream was a given in middle to upper middle class South, and this is a time I well remember. As children of the 60s, Delia and Eli are members of the Boomer generation, which was the largest single generation up to that point in American history, although I think millennials are now overtaking the baby boomers in numbers. And this generation of young people had a tremendous effect on popular culture because of their sheer numbers. And popular culture had a tremendous effect and powerful influence on them. The baby boomers developed a greater generational consciousness than previous generations, and they sought to identify their identities in a lot of ways, particularly through music. And Eli is a musician. He is a percussionist. He loves the sound of bells, which is one of the meanings, or many meanings of bells. in the novel, but that's one of them. But he's obsessed with both the sound of bells, ringing bells, climbing bell towers, many things associated with bells. And though Delia's and Eli's musical tastes sometimes intersect in the popular songs of the period and portrayed in Bells for Eli, there's a long playlist of music in the book. The differences in their musical taste characterize the contrast between the status quo in their small town and the nonconformity of the counterculture. And that's one of the big conflicts in the novel, is these two worlds merging. So that music from the 60s, emerging from the introduction of rock and roll in the 50s, that celebrated themes of love and freedom, and I think of Bill Haley and the Comets, and that anthem for rebellion. Doesn't seem like it now, but Rock Around the Clock at the time was an anthem for rebellion. And Elvis Presley's gyrating hips that were censored. I remember watching that show on the Ed Sullivan Show, and they could only film Elvis Presley from the waist up because it was just plain lewd to do anything else. And in the 60s, popular music among teenagers split among a number of genres, but I think the major divide was what I'll loosely call soft rock and hard rock. And exhibiting his rebellious spirit, Eli gravitates toward hard rock. Groups like Led Zeppelin, The Who, The Grateful Dead, and his favorite songs are A Stairway to Heaven and A Whiter Shade of Pale. With its emphasis on overt masculinity and sexuality, hard rock very much typifies Eli's behavior. And also, in part because of the tremendous trauma of his childhood, Eli wants to escape his feelings. And so consequently, he becomes a risk taker with a rebellious spirit, and hard rock music, aligned with the drug culture, lures him. So I'm going to read a little passage from the novel. And Eli and Delia are teenagers at this point in the novel, and he's talking about one of these two favorite songs of his, Stairway to Heaven. They're in a car. They're parked in a car after a dance to which Eli has taken Delia to help her get over, so to speak, what he believes is a destructive romantic relationship that she has been in. Eli reached into the console and retrieved a tape. He turned the ignition and inserted his 8-track of Led Zeppelin 4. It started on Black Dog. I knew what was coming soon, the favorite song of Eli's life, Stairway to Heaven. He loved its aggression and emotion, unresolved and mystical. He loved it too, because it was lonely. The tender opening chords began on the guitar. The recorders followed with their sweet and expectant melody, reminiscent of time long ago. I imagined Elizabethan maidens in brocade gowns tiptoeing about on a mossy forest floor. And I should say Delia is the first person speaker here. The radio will play this song forever. Other bands will play it, Eli said. It will last, mark my words. Not because of the lyrics. They're imprinted on your brain, but they're bullshit pompous. It's the music that matters. Listen. We leaned back into our seats. I closed my eyes. Eli reached for my hand. A minor, he whispered, haunting. It's the unknown flirting with you, like our Ouija board. I waited for the crescendo to build toward the long and dramatic guitar, and then the come down at the end, the near silence as the song faded. It's like life, Eli said when the song ended. Tension and release. He squeezed my hand and let it go. He ejected the tape. Now Delia, on the other hand, typifies to a large degree the norm of the small town South in which she lives. Unlike her cousin, she likes soft rock, the songs of such groups as Three Dog Night, The Temptations. She even admits to liking bubblegum music, which was, some of you might remember bubblegum music, a subgenre containing seemingly childlike themes and a contrived innocence. Lyrics of these songs often featured Themes of romantic love, personal happiness, references to sunshine, toys, sugary foods. What is it, that song? Oh, Simple Simon Says. You remember that song? It was at the 1910 Fruit Gum Company, I think, sang Simple Simon Says, and it's a very childlike song. So Delia even likes some of that music. While Eli lets his hair grow long even before his teen years and tells Delia he's going to be a hippie, she doesn't follow suit. She does not embrace drugs and the counterculture. And yet, it's not this either-or sort of thing. She's not completely content. She is not like her friend Neely, who feels secure in the way things are. Delia exhibits a desire for independence beginning in grammar school when she chooses a career outfit for her Barbie doll, not a house dress and apron such as Delia's mother wears. And though Delia has no notion of the coming women's liberation movement during her youth, she knows herself. She desires autonomy and is fortunate that to live in a family and to have parents who allow her to embrace, or at least for some part, her mother's holds her back a bit, but she is to some degree able to embrace her independence. She displays some of her earliest urges for autonomy when she resists. Her mother is overprotective, and she does resist that overprotective mother. So I was going to read another passage here to illustrate Delia. This takes place when she returns home after she and Eli have been victimized in Eli's yard by new boys in their neighborhood. Eli is trying to be accepted. He wants to be part of the crowd. He has just come out of the physical disfigurement, and he's trying to prove himself, and it's been a very difficult scene, and Delia has been there during this time. So she comes back home and has a conversation with her mother, and I think it shows her pushing. At home, Mama stood over the stove frying onions and peppers to start spaghetti sauce. It was awfully warm for spaghetti, but it was a favorite of my daddy. The front part of her hair formed a wet circle around her face, little brown curls smashed flat to her skin. "How lovely," she exclaimed on seeing the flowers. "Did Mary Lily send those to me?" I nodded. That's Eli's mother, who's a gardener. Moments later, I began to cry. She sat me at the table. I poured out the story to her, the boys, the tickling, Uncle Gene's belt to punish Eli. She rose and turned down the stove. She walked to the white metal cabinet, my nemesis with its rusty squeaking hinge, because I could never sneak a snack without her knowing. It squeaked loudly now as she opened the door. She held out a small green bottle, one of her coveted Coca-Colas. My heart leaped. Normally, I was allowed this luxury only at Sunday lunch and on occasion after school. She lifted the church key from the drawer and pried off the cap. She pursed her lips as she emptied ice cubes from the metal tray into a glass and poured the fizzing brown tonic over the ice. "You're growing up, Delia," she said, handing me the Coke, her first word since I'd told the whole story. "Things will be different. It's hard for me to explain, but let me try. Boys play differently," she continued, "and it's other things too. I know you love Eli, and you will always be close. It's just that you can't tell me not to play with Eli. He's my best friend," I interrupted her, all but shouting. Coke burned up my nose. I started to cry again. "Of course, I don't mean that, but things have to change, Delia. They just do. But Eli isn't like other boys," I said. "I love him more than my best friend," I started to say, but didn't. "It was Dale and Drew and Craig who caused all the trouble," I said instead. "Yes and no," she responded. I didn't know what she meant. I only knew I felt worse than before. The Coca-Cola now felt like a bribe. "Never mind, Mama, just never mind. I shouldn't have told you," I said, and left the last few sips of Coke in the glass. "Delia," she called, "when your daddy gets home, we can talk about this better." But I had already left the room and pretended I didn't hear. Well, in addition to music, television provided the American population with the experience of accepted social patterns that began in the 50s and continued into the 60s and 70s. Unlike music, there were really very few television shows that projected anything anti-establishment. Not until 1967, with the Smothers Brothers and their political satire, and Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In 1968, did television shows begin to suggest the counterculture of the 60s. It's kind of strange to think back on that now, that television lagged behind. Laugh-In, as we might remember, was a play on the love-ins of the 1960s hippies culture that were common in protests associated with civil rights and anti-war demonstrations of the time. And the show was characterized by quick gags, sketches, many of which conveyed sexual innuendo or were politically charged. And in the small-town South, this mild show was considered somewhat scandalous. And young people who watched the show, this young person, at that time, often did so on the sly. Most television shows presented an idealized image of white suburban family life. Happy housewife mothers, wise fathers, mischievous but not dangerously rebellious children were constant in the shows. You know them, Leave It to Beaver, My Three Sons, Andy of Mayberry. And such is the culture that the people in Green Branch, South Carolina, emulate. And my novel mentions a number of television shows of the era in relation to events in the novel. Like the characters' behavior in the shows the Winfield and Green families watch on television during prime time, hospitality and proper decorum are not choices among the middle and upper middle class in 1960s Green Branch. They are expectations. Family values are emphasized, and pretending life is good, even if it isn't, that's the way it is. Delia's parents lived by the book, just like the examples that would have been seen on television. If there were something amiss in the grown-up world of her parents, and of course there is, because they're human, Delia and her sister would never know. It's only through eavesdropping that Delia learns information of her parents' hidden anxieties. And often these disagreements between her parents occur because Delia wants to step outside the established protocol. Now, Eli's everyday family life, conversely, is not the norm of the times, but his mother knows how to make everything seem right. She is the epitome of graciousness and decorum, and she rarely confronts the problem of Eli's father and her husband being alcoholic. As Gene, her husband, rants and raves, acting violently at times in the presence of anyone in his path, Mary Lily mostly tolerates her husband's dysfunction, taking a passive role, which was very common for wives in the 1960s. And the scene that I read after Delia comes home, after the incident with the boys in the neighborhood, I'm going to read one more little scene, and this one actually takes place before Delia comes home and tells her mother the story, but it shows a sort of passivity or expectation that women or wives had in the small town of the 1960s. So in this little scene, after the scene with Eli and Delia have both been abused by neighborhood boys, and it's a circumstance that Eli very much wants to keep secret. His mother knows, but he doesn't want his mother to tell. So Delia observes her aunt, Eli's mother's, passivity as her Uncle Gene, Mary Lily's husband, prepares to punish his son for speaking rudely to his mother. Apologize before we go inside and mean it, or the licks with this belt will be twice as many, Uncle Gene commanded. I'm sorry, Eli said stiffly. Then I saw him mouth to his mother, don't tell him. Don't tell anyone what happened. At that moment, no one on the porch was the person I thought I knew. Not Eli, compressed with anger, nor Mary Lily sitting statuesque, though clearly I saw her eyes brimming. And especially not Gene, unyielding, his caterpillar eyebrows drawn together toward the bridge of his nose. I had no concept of the beating that awaited Eli. The most I ever got was a couple of pops on the bottom with Mama's green hairbrush. My father's hand had spanked me only once. When I lied to him about emptying green peas from my plate, I detested them. Behind the kitchen door, next to my seat at the dining table, I insisted Helen had pitched the peas. I was spanked for lying, for blaming my sister, not for hating peas. I thought Mary Lily would speak up on Eli's behalf, but she never moved or said a word. She sat in that same position until Eli walked ahead of Jean into the house. I realized this beating was not a first-time occurrence when she took a deep breath and exhaled very slowly. I didn't know what to do. I was frightened. If I'm honest, though I had never been his victim, and Eli never told me anything concrete, I knew Uncle Gene possessed an inclination to be cruel. My aunt abruptly stood, reached out, took my hand. Shaking out her skirt, she asked me to walk with her to the back garden. She stood tall and straight, her willowy figure still composed. I wondered if she was taking me from the house so I wouldn't hear Eli react from inside, but I couldn't imagine my resolute cousin surrendering to screams. Nevertheless, she hurried me away and held my hand all the way as we walked, remarking she had late zinnias blooming and would cut some for my mother. Ellison will be fine, she said finally, and squeezed my hand. I didn't think he'd be fine at all. I didn't think Mary Lily was in some kind of denial. I thought she was scared too of Uncle Gene, who never even asked Eli to explain, who was whipping my cousin with his belt. If Mary Lily were a capable, she's a musician, a Juilliard pianist. If she were this capable, talented woman in today's world, Mary Lily would not likely stay with an alcoholic, volatile husband, but divorce was rare during this era. In some ways it's not that long ago, and yet it is long ago when you think how much has happened since that time. In my own life in South Carolina in the 60s, and granted I'm in a small town, I knew of no couples, zero, among my parents' friends who divorced. I recall overhearing a discussion between my parents about one of my mother's very close friends who wanted to leave her alcoholic husband. My mother said she knew how her friend suffered, and my father agreed. My parents hoped she might take her children and leave the abusive relationship. In the end, though, my mother's friend decided it would be too disgraceful to leave her husband, and though she had a college education, told my mother she had no idea how to make a life on her own. As this real-life example illustrates, and Mary Lily in the novel illustrates, beneath the surface of the supposed idyllic small-town South, life was not always paradise that families and the culture pretended. People didn't talk about their problems. Going to counseling was almost unheard of. They tended to cover over their difficulties and live with their unhappiness. And of course, in the 70s, no-fault divorce laws finally came into being and things began to change. But in Bells for Eli, times had not yet changed. Having witnessed her aunt and uncle's dysfunctional relationship since childhood as a nearly grown woman, my character Delia wonders why Mary Lily has stayed with Uncle Gene when she says to her aunt, this is near the end of the novel, "You're beautiful and so smart. You could have been a famous musician, but you married Uncle Gene. You stayed with him." And for a moment, Mary Lily doesn't respond. She starts, she stops, and then she says, "You've been under our roof all your life. You know his weaknesses, but we all have weaknesses. He's a good man in his way, Adeline, and he's my husband, for better or for worse." These frictions between expected behavior and conduct in the small town South of the 60s and 70s and the burgeoning strains of rebellion and independence emerging from the fringes of society parallel many of the tensions among the characters in the novel, particularly between Delia and Eli in their late adolescence as the novel moves toward its dramatic conclusion. And as I mentioned earlier, Delia learns a shocking secret about Eli she has never known. Thank you for listening. And I am happy if anybody has one.
I do.
Okay.
So you mentioned in the beginning that your inspiration was biographical in that you had a cousin
I did.
who had suffered a disability. If I were to read the book, would I have a synopsis of, through your characters, your perspective of a small town during the 1960s in this country?
Yes.
In the
Yes.
South.
The first
the
person
deep
speaker,
South.
Delia.
In
Yes, very much. It's a very, or I've been told, it's a very atmospheric novel, and it very much sets the scene of what life was really like in the 1960s and 70s. And as I said, that was my era, so I lived it, and I hope that I have created it in the novel.
So that would be autobiographical as well, right?
Well, I mean, the setting, I don't know if it's autobiographical because I personally didn't live these scenes. They are imagined, but Green Branch is a fictitious town, but it is very typical of what small towns in South Carolina were like in the 1960s and early 70s. But it's I don't know if autobiographical is the right word. It just is the way the world was that I knew and during that time. But these characters and their lives and their predicaments and their conflicts are imagined.
But it is your perspective.
It is. It is. It certainly is.
You know, first novels are so often autobiographical to a degree that you start from someplace and you start with what you know, right? But I'm curious, when you went on this journey to write a novel, you'd written stories, and did you have was there ever a moment where you thought, this is getting too close to family's material, that I could go over the line, that I'm going to upset people? Did you think about discussing it, or did you just plow ahead and tell the story you set out to
Well,
write?
that's a good question. Since the opening scene, which is the accident that Eli has, is inspired from my cousin's life, I worried, he's not living today, but I worried that his sisters, my cousins Emma and Jeannie, to whom I actually dedicated the book, I worried that they would be upset because that accident is lifted from life. And before I ever let anyone else really read the novel, I sent the original manuscript to both of them. They both live in North Carolina. They both live in the Chapel Hill area. And they separately called me and said that, go forward. We love it. Go forward. And this is a wonderful story. And after that, I just didn't worry anymore.
Yeah, that's great.
So,
Took care of that.
yeah,
Right
yes,
right off the gate.
yes.
You're such a your style of writing is so beautiful.
Well, thank
I mean,
you.
I think that there's something there more than the plot and more than the 60s, and it's the
I hope
sentence by
so.
sentence writing. I'm amazed that you waited as long to write your first novel.
Well,
It feels like it was really in you for a long
well,
time.
I guess it was. I wish I were one of these super people who could do a whole bunch of things simultaneously. But when I was teaching and raising two daughters and taking care of aging, my mother died at the age I am now, but then taking care of my aging father and then my mother's sister, I just wanted somebody who I need big blocks. I could write short stories and did, but I needed big blocks of time to work on chapters of a novel. So I had to wait until I had big blocks of time. So here I am at this mature age with a debut novel.
So I grew up in the same kind of time in the Deep South,
You did?
but my experience was not colored as much by the encroachment of the counterculture on the idyllic middle class, setup, as it was my perception was different because I was an outsider to that small town.
Okay.
By the conflict with the racial cloud,
Oh, yeah.
and
Yes.
moving among
yes.
and below and around, and
Mhm.
inside of. And my father was raised in New York, upstate New York, and my mother in the South. And so that was kind of like the conflict played out in the micro, in the macro, and everywhere.
Mhm.
And I wonder, is that just something that you don't color into your
Oh
context?
no, it's very much here. There are racial conflicts here, and there's some unfortunate situations that existed with race in the novel that Eli and Delia have to deal with. That's very
Are
difficult.
they in school during desegregation?
They are, but in South Carolina, full integration of schools took place in the fall of 1970, I think. So Eli gets sent off to boarding school for his behavioral issues when he is in high school. So, but there is a racial situation that occurs when he's in boarding school in the Northeast, and he thinks that what he calls Yankee boys will not have racial prejudice. And there's a African American boy from the South. So the only two Southern boys in that school are Eli and this African American boy from the South. And Eli doesn't think that Blease will suffer consequences, and he's wrong. And so there's a pretty big scene there. But he's not in a public high school. But yes, those issues do come into play.
That's exciting. How long did it take you to get, once you were able?
It took me about a year to write the manuscript, maybe writing about 4 nights a week. I don't recommend anybody follow my schedule for writing. People need to write in the morning, in a normal time of day. But for me, when it gets dark and my husband has gone to bed, he tends to go to bed earlier than I do, and it's quiet and there are no distractions and the dogs have even gone to sleep,
You're free.
that's when I write. That's when my mind is free. So I wrote maybe 4 or so nights out of the week for about a year for the original manuscript. And then the original manuscript underwent some major revision. So for another year.
Susan, do you already have another novel in mind?
I do. I'm working on it. I've been so, what's the right word, consumed during the pandemic with trying to get the book in front of readers in unusual ways, or new ways, I should say, with social media and virtual events and print reviews and word of mouth. I've spent so much time with that and continue to, but I have started a novel that's set in present day. Jonathan mentioned that I taught English for a long time, so I'm very familiar with the classroom. So this novel at present has a high school English teacher, not me, but I know about teaching English, a privileged, very smart white boy, and a bright but impoverished biracial girl, and the 2 teenagers will meet in school suspension, and that will propel the novel. And my challenge, and boy am I finding out it's a challenge, is I very much need to tell this story from the 3 points of view. And I just hope that my brain has the capability to keep the threads going and not forget what I've already said. We'll see if it works.
You
But
may have to make a graphic organizer.
I know, and I don't want to, but I may have to. I've written 3 chapters, and now in chapter 4, I'm coming back around, and I'm thinking, yeah, I may have to do a graphic organizer.
Do you write at a level that you would recommend it for, like, a really enthusiastic 14-year-old female reader?
It is a very mature 14-year-old. This is an adult novel. It's got some adult scenes in it. It's got some language in it. It does have some tough things in it. So I think high school juniors and seniors who are mature are fine with it, but I would recommend an adult reading the novel first and then deciding whether to let a 14-year-old read it. I probably would have read it as a 14-year-old, but then I went to the library and read, of course my books are a little more mature than this, but Mr. and Mrs. Bojo Jones was one of the influential novels from my high school years, and the author was a mentor of Pat Conroy's. Ironically, I found that, and I read that book because my mother told me not to read the book. She said, I understand that book is not something that you need to read because it was about a young teenage couple having a baby, she got pregnant out of wedlock, which was, and back then. So I read the novel. And
What was the name of it?
Mr. and Mrs. Bojo Jones.
Okay.
Fabulous novel. I don't have the greatest memory in the world, so I don't remember a whole lot of. I read a lot in high school, but I don't remember a whole lot that I read. So if I remember a book, it really meant something,
Yeah.
and it was a very powerful book to me.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Did you ever fess up that you read it?
Oh yeah, I did. That was one of my great pleasures in life. You know, my mother would say, I don't think you should do that. And then I'd do it and I'd say, want to read this book, Mom? It's really pretty good.
Yeah, I wonder.
Because at that point she couldn't do anything.
I wonder if a 14-year-old today is the same as we were when we were 14, because I don't think so.
No, probably not. And I imagine
Yeah.
probably these scenes they could handle.
Yeah, I would guess that a 14-year-old today
Pretty wise.
is,
Yeah.
has, unfortunately, in some ways, but.
Yeah. You know, it's not, in other words, I don't think a school would adopt this book for 8th and 9th graders. That's about the age, right? I don't think that would happen, but I think you're exactly right. I think most 14-year-olds are well aware
Yeah.
of any of the material in this novel.
I would like them to read it because the writing is so strong.
Oh,
And
thank you.
They give especially if they have a sense that you're writing about your time, they understand that they're surrounded by material, that their culture and everything else is something that's available to a person who
Right.
is creative.
Right.
Because
It's
that's
hard to get
basically
someone to
two
expose.
generations above a 14-year-old, basically.
It is.
So, yeah, I wonder how interested they are in that.
I have a I mean, I don't know if an author should say this about her own work, but I have a feeling if a 14-year-old gets a hold of this, he or she probably will enjoy it.
I think so too, and I guess the idea of cousins, I hadn't read anything that really dealt with that sexual attraction between cousins,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that probably is fairly common
Yeah.
because of the amount of exposure, people have within families. And so I think that might really interest a 14-year-old.
And yet, I mean, it's a tremendous conflict in the novel because they know it's taboo. They know they cannot really act on this, and yet they can't really. When you grow up bonded the way they do, once they become sexual beings, it's inevitable. And an interviewer asked me early on why I decided to write about a sexually taboo relationship. And it kind of stunned me because I realized I didn't decide to do it. I really did not decide to do it.
Yeah.
I set out to write a novel about cousins closely bonded, who protected each other, but I really didn't know that was going to happen. And one of those dark nights when I was writing and they were coming home from a dance, Eli has taken Delia to a dance. He is from, his mother is from a moneyed family. Delia's is not. So he's taken her to this cotillion in Columbia, South Carolina, a real town, to try to help her move on from what he considers, and it is, it's presented as a destructive romantic relationship for Delia. And they are parked in the car, and Eli is confessing something, a pretty big something about himself to try to dissuade Delia. And they just, one thing leads to another, and they realize they've always had, and they have these feelings for each other. And so when the interviewer asked me that, I said, that night I was writing, I don't want to sound too mystical, but they just went where they wanted to go. I couldn't stop that. It wasn't my place to stop it. They were the characters, and they were taking me where they needed to go. It was their lives, and it was inevitable for them to have those feelings, and therefore it was inevitable for me as the author to write them. It was my job to write it, and that's how it happened. I didn't set out to do it.
Are you getting ready to write a novel?
Yes,
Sorry, did I miss
yeah,
that?
Pat asked that question earlier. I'm trying, I'm working on it. I've got 3 chapters drafted and I'm,
Right.
working on it. I'm getting inspired. Maybe I'll work on it tonight when it gets dark. Anything else? Thank you all for being here on this very warm day and these very unusual circumstances. And thank you, Jonathan, and thank you to the Pat Conroy Center and to Pat for allowing me to be here.
Thank you, Susan. It's been an absolute pleasure. Really wonderful program. Thank you so much.
Thank you.